I wanted to first kind of present you guys with a new model I'm working on through the Spiritual Intelligence series, and really in continuing our conversation on Kriya, which we've been having over these last few weeks, and then we'll get into the questions. And I'm sure that this discussion will probably spark a lot of questions too. But what I want to present you guys with today, as we've, taking the context of what we've been talking about with Kundalini and Kriya, the technique of Kriya, is seeing enlightenment as a neurological condition. And I'll be putting a video into the Spiritual Intelligence series at some point soon, probably called the Neurology of Enlightenment. But I think this is really a helpful thing to understand, especially for the practice of Kriya, but for all spiritual practice. Really what we're doing is we are preparing our nervous system for a condition that we call classically enlightenment to begin to manifest. So I've been really interested for quite some time in wanting to develop like a very scientific approach to self-actualization, which Kriya is, but even one that incorporates masculine modalities into it, like an entire protocol one can follow. What's the most, efficient way to open and increase my capacity for the divine? And so through my studies of yoga, my obsession with yoga and the Upanishads and Vedic texts, which describe enlightenment sort of as a neurological condition, it's allowed me to just connect so many dots, and even to experience this phenomenon, this process in myself over the last few years doing these practices has been a really incredible journey to observe how this process plays out and start to learn different ways, along the journey as we do, for increasing that process or accelerating that process. And so to give you an idea of what we mean when we say enlightenment is a neurological condition, if we think about, so the law of one talks about distortions, right? And we mention that word a lot, but what is a distortion? Is it just an idea, or is it a real thing? Well, we know through neuroscience that we have our neurons are either positively charged or negatively charged. And so when we have a lot of identification with ego, we could say that ego is also a neurological condition, but it's a very primitive or unevolved state of the nervous system. And that's because every identity of the ego, every attachment, every trauma that it stores, they form these little psychic knots throughout our energy network, right? And in fact, ego itself is a psychic knot, the Hindu texts say, in the mind that we have to penetrate through awareness and self-inquiry and things like Kriya, and dissipate and dissolve those knots over time. So that's what a distortion is. When Ra uses that term in the law of one, they are referencing these energetic concentrations of negatively polarized energy. So what's really cool is that if this is just kind of neuroscience, but if a neuron is negatively charged, then I believe sodium ions are the negatively charged ion. There's a bunch of sodium ions that kind of floating around that neuron. And when the neuron's not being activated or stimulated, it's in a state called resting potential. And when it's stimulated by, an event, a perception you might have, that is called the action potential. And so these neurons, when they're activated, the neuron will open for about 2 milliseconds, and all those negatively charged sodium ions will flood into the nerve. And then the nerve sends a burst of energy up to the brain, and we experience that as anger or fear or anxiety, stress, and so forth, some kind of negative emotion. And so if we see the negative thought or the negative feeling and we identify with it, we say, oh, I'm feeling that. That's my negative emotion. That's my story. That's my trauma, my memory. That's me feeling and thinking this. Well, that is taking energy from the brain and sending it back to the neuron. So that distortion, when we identify with it, is amped up with more energy over time. And we're just beefing up that distortion. And so the suffering gets increasingly worse until the state of our nervous system is so uninhabitable, you might say, that we start crying out for answers. How do I escape this torment? And it's not possible to have a peaceful state of consciousness when you have all of these psychic knots or distortions in your energy system, right? So Kriya is a feminine approach to disentangling these knots or healing them. And awareness, self-examination, self-inquiry is a masculine approach to dissipating these negative charged neurons. When that signal goes up to the brain, the neuron sends a bunch of its energy up to the brain, and we don't identify with the thought or the story or the feeling. We just observe it and say, I see that. I'm aware of that. Then that energy goes back to the neuron and it's diminished because it didn't get fueled up at the brain. Does that make sense? So now we've starved that neuron of a little bit more of its energy. So the masculine approach essentially starves these neurons or distortions over time through detachment and awareness. But through a feminine method, we can actually go into the neuron and push positively polarized energy into it to create that depolarization process. That's what shadow work is. Shadow work is when we try to access those memories, right? We try to remember how I felt when that thing happened. And when I remember how I felt, that's when that neuron has opened and it's sending that negative information up to my brain. But instead of resisting it or complaining about it as we normally do, which beefs it up, we say, I forgive you, I love you, I understand why you felt that way. It's not wrong to feel what you felt. And we give it that loving energy. Well, that is actually sending positively polarized energy into the neuron and depolarizing it. So the feminine method is a method of power, and it can actually completely heal something in a moment, in an instant. Whereas the masculine approach is more of a default mode you have to be in, of just being aware of your mind. And over time, it's going to gradually dissipate those distortions. So the sort of scientific approach, you might say, that I've been working on is really combining both of these together, which we do in the masterclass, right? We do Kriya yoga, and the whole masterclass is all about mind training and awareness. But we can even get more specific in terms of like a protocol we can do every single day. And so I've been working on, in terms of a feminine practice, I've been working on something that combines basically the three best approaches to stimulating the nervous system that I've ever come across. And that's basically through bandhas, which we've talked a little bit about, pranayama, and kriya. So pranayama is breath work. And I typically like to do kind of holotropic style breath work, or we call it fire breathing, really rapid inhalation, exhalation. And fire breathing or holotropic breathing is about trying to change the balance of carbon and oxygen so that you build up more carbon than you are building up oxygen. And then it creates these altered states of consciousness, and you can do a lot of inner healing that way. So that's a really powerful way of stimulating the nervous system. And in Kundalini yoga, fire breathing is one of the most powerful methods for stimulating Kundalini. So breath work number one. Number two is the bandhas. And this is the most complicated kind of aspect of the technique, but a bandha is a method of hatha yoga, which is a Sanskrit word that means lock. So there's three main bandhas to learn. The Mula Bandha, which we've talked a lot about, that's the root lock. Uddiyana Bandha, which is the gut lock, or you do kind of doing a vacuum, pulling your belly button into your spine. And then Jalanhara Bandha, which is the throat lock. And that's just kind of this motion, bringing the chest to the chin and sitting the chin down to kind of crunch that nerve bundle in the throat. And when you do all three of these bandhas at the same time, it's called the Maha Bandha, which is the great lock in Sanskrit. And this is an incredibly powerful stimulation technique that I've measured using my brainwave device. If I'm scanning my brainwaves, I can do the Maha Bandha, just to give you an example of how powerful this is. And I'll watch my gamma waves move from about 40 decibels down here, and they'll shoot up all the way to 70 or 80 decibels. So doubling in strength. And I'll hold that Maha Bandha for about 5 to 7 seconds. And then that's kind of the end of the practice. And then I repeat. So it's basically Kriya, 7 rounds of Kriya with a Mahabandha at the end of each Kriya. And then after 7 rounds of that, you do 1 whole round of fire breathing, which we've done on this course before. So I'm not really sure, what to call this, but it's a method I've been doing since about October. And, I really can't put into words the way that it has changed my quality of consciousness in such a short amount of time. We've talked about how Kriya, all the famous Kriya yogi masters describe it as being a kind of super accelerator for spiritual evolution, because when you're pushing and pulling more energy into the network, you're accelerating the rate of spiritual evolution in the nervous system. So Kriya is always the number one most important practice for doing that. But when we add the Mahabandha from Hatha Yoga, which pushes a ton of energy up to the brain, and a Kundalini technique of fire breathing, which also stimulates Kundalini energy, it's this incredible synergy that it'll take you a little bit of time to learn. But once you learn the technique and you just start doing it every day, I'm telling you, it's a game changer. It is like the most powerful technique I've ever come across for truly expanding your capacity for the divine. You'll start to notice one thing. First would be noticing how your appetite and cravings for sense pleasures diminish, and your calmness of mind increases. Ra says that energy is actually intelligent energy, right? All energy is intelligent. It's self-organizing. So a brain, a spine, a Kundalini network full of energy is a very happy brain. So we want to give it lots of energy every day through these practices. And the other thing you'll notice is your capacity for realization will also deepen very dramatically. Meaning as you're contemplating, contemplating the nature of reality or contemplating oneness, these huge epiphanies start dropping in to your awareness that you go, oh my gosh, just like blows the doors off. We can call it a mystical experience if we want, but these are very important experiences to have because they signify that your capacity for the divine is increasing, right? The depth and profundity of realizations you're able to have represents your capacity opening. And so I think I'll probably call it something like neurotropic breathwork, because it's really more about stimulating the nervous system. Tropic is a Latin word, trepen, I believe, which means like a return to. So neurotropic would mean like a return to the nervous system, bringing it back to the subtle body, bringing your attention back to the subtle body, and really spending time cultivating your energy. But I will say, there are some criteria before adopting a practice of this, intensity, we might say. And that is number one, dietary choices. I've mentioned the story of my experience at Joe Dispenza, where I did the fire breathing and a very similar practice to what I just described, Dispenza does. And, I had a lightning shoot out of my fingers. I had a full-on flu experience afterwards, because this kind of breath work can stimulate a detox, which is a good thing, but it can be uncomfortable, right? So people who have those really kind of painful, dramatic Kundalini awakenings, it's typically because their nervous system wasn't prepared, right? They had a very weak, narrow nervous system that wasn't ready for that bandwidth, that volume of energy. And so it manifests as psychic distortions, physical illnesses and ailments, or a flu type of experience. So for that reason, I just say, make sure your diet is cleaned up before you jump into something like this. I would even recommend, like a juice cleanse. Raw sugarcane juice is my favorite. But even just, shopping organic, not eating junk food, nothing processed. All of these toxins in your body directly affect your nervous system. So a healthy body is probably the number one most important catalyst for spiritual evolution. It's just really hard to evolve your nervous system this way when you're loading your body with tons of toxins and GMOs and different kinds of poison in our food. So a really clean diet is critical, which the Hindus also stress. The Hindus have everything figured out. It's just amazing. They have this whole thing down to a science like 5,000 years ago. I think they've found paintings on walls in the Indus Valley that date back to 3,000 years BC, so 5,000 years ago. And there's these drawings of Shiva in a yoga asana position with a snake Kundalini rising up to his head, and he's in a state of ecstasy. And so we have pretty definitive proof that people have been practicing the science of nervous system cultivation, Kundalini yoga, for over 5,000 years minimum. You know, who knows how long it goes back, but to learn from these cultures and traditions and add what Western science and modern science knows about brain waves and the nervous system, when we put them together, man, we can come up with some really powerful practices to accelerate this evolutionary process. So I'm going to be creating a video on neurotropic breathwork to put into the masterclass for you guys, which will kind of be like Kriya 2.0. If you've been doing Kriya for a while and you want to go to the next level, then we can add the pranayama techniques I mentioned and the bandhas especially. And I'll give you kind of the protocol of the cycles of how it works and repetitions and whatnot. And then I'll probably even include some guidelines based on the SQ chart of like, if you're at this level of SQ, maybe just 10 minutes a day. You know, you want to begin where your capacity is currently at. You don't want to jump into trying to do, 30-minute sessions twice a day if your nervous system's not ready. So that's something that you'll also know pretty clearly right away when you start. You'll notice there, your body can feel really tired and blown out if you've done too much. So you'll get a feel for it, but over time, as your capacity increases, you can start doing longer and longer sessions. And then in conjunction with that, I'm going to be highly recommending transcendental meditation, which is kind of a masculine approach or practice. And if you've done transcendental meditation, it's basically just mantra meditation. As many of you know, there's been an enormous volume of studies and scientific research on TM that shows really profound effects on the brain and biomarkers, the nervous system. They've even compared TM meditators with like Zen meditators and measured the brainwave differences. And they found that people doing TM for like 6 months have brainwaves even surpassing or similar to Zen meditators who've been practicing for years. So that's all going to be coming down the pipe later. I'm not going to get into TM on this call, but we can talk about that more in later sessions if you guys want. But I'd love to talk more about this process with you guys. If anyone has questions about it today, about anything I just went over, or really just the practice of Kriya itself and the science of Kriya and how you can begin using it in your practice. So 25 minutes in, it's a good point to jump into the questions.